I apologize for the delay on this video. I wanted to wait until V2 dropped before I made it, so I could run an actual match and maybe make a match analysis video where I talked both about the new heli flight model and how I run helicopters in general. But V2 has been delayed quite a bit and I've been doing some practice offline, so I figured I would make it now. There's a lot of good with this new flight model. It is significantly better than the last one, but there's also a bit of bad and a little bit of ugly. And I'm going to get into each of those in turn. But first, let's talk about what worked well with this and give credit where it's due. The first thing I'd like to mention is the way that you build and lose speed feels significantly better. You build speed in a much more linear fashion. Your top speed is quite a bit faster than it was before, and there's none of that artificial speed limit pushing you back. And then when you actually want to drop speed, you have to put a lot of thought into that, do it well in advance, and work towards dropping the speed that you've built up. There's no more starting and stopping on a dime. There's no more VTOL, hover mode, flight mode bullshit. It just works really well. This is obviously the very first thing I noticed when flying, and immediately it gave me the right first impression. Similarly, it seems like all of your different methods of controlling the helicopter have similar results. They're no longer wildly different from one another. For example, if I pitch down about 5 degrees, build a tiny bit of speed, and then pitch up about 5 degrees, I will lose that speed at about the same rate. If I roll to the right, roughly 5 degrees, kind of hard to determine, you'll see that I'm picking up speed in that direction, and if I roll to the left, same deal. Don't use the knots counter, just use my relation to the ground. Ultimately, it doesn't feel like there's any wildly different means of controlling your helicopter depending on which axis you use, so if you're doing something like a J-turn, you can use each of them intuitively to your heart's desire without having to memorize the wonky-ass way your helicopter will react when you throw in a little bit of roll into your yaw and then pull a little bit of pitch and have wildly different results for all of those functions. Now it feels linear and it feels smooth, which is absolutely fantastic and matches really well with the acceleration to ultimately make the flight model workable. It just feels good in the air. It's not perfect, I don't think anyway, but as we move on to the things that are less than perfect, I want to put up a big disclaimer and say I'm not a pilot. I'm basing this off of my experience with other video games, some of which try to take the helicopter's flight models very seriously and get them as close to real life as they can, and others of which are just trying to make them feel appropriate and easy to use. The point is that all of my experience comes from people trying to replicate helicopters, not from helicopters themselves, so everything should be taken with a grain of salt. One of the things that I would like to point out, though, is that your yaw control is very limited even at lowish speeds. This is full right yaw, and this is full left yaw, and that's at 60 knots. If we get up to cruising speed, or a little under cruising speed, anywhere from 70 to, say, 80 knots with this flight model, which, by the way, I should mention is still quite a bit slower than most of these helicopters are capable of in real life. It still is artificially reduced a bit, another thing to point out. If I get up to those speeds, this is full A, full D. It's basically nothing. So what ends up happening is you end up using a lot more roll to control the helicopter, which makes some sense. You should be putting in a bit of roll to control helicopters at these speeds anyway, but it's almost exclusively what's actually doing the turning, which means if you were trying to follow something like a river valley, which you might be doing on Kohat or Lashkar, even at lowish speeds, even not at these high speeds that we're flying at now, you actually do need to put quite a bit of roll into it. And then because you're already dropping out of the sky, you kind of need to compensate by putting quite a bit of pitch into it, and then leveling out and attempting to adjust for the fact that you just lost a lot of altitude. You're fairly likely to crash if you do this too aggressively and then don't compensate for it in time. Notice how kind of heavily I'm pitching up here to maintain my altitude. If I were to go immediately level afterwards, after trying to carve down a river valley like this, there's going to be some situations where I come pretty close to striking trees like this. And I think it's a little bit worse in other flight models. I cannot tell if this shares the Blackhawk flight model yet. I've tried them both, and they seem pretty similar. But I was noticing it a tiny bit more in the Blackhawk. I'm not sure if that was a result of my flying. See, there you go. I tail struck that tree because I was putting quite heavily a lot of roll into pitch to actually do my turning rather than yaw. I think this is realistic to some extent, like in the way that it's handled, just not the extent that they go to with limiting your yaw and how heavy the weather vane effect is. But once again, not an actual pilot, so take that with a grain of salt. But it definitely could be more of an accessibility thing. Since they're obviously not going for one-to-one flight models, I think having a bit more yaw would be a bit nicer. I'm going to splice in some footage from another game that's designed to be both realistic and accessible, which is War Thunder. What I want you to pay attention to here is how in the War Thunder flight model, it is much easier for me to break the weather vane effect. There is air all around my helicopter, and if I'm traveling in a straight line, I'm going to be adding drag and adding resistance by then rotating to the left or rotating to the right. And in War Thunder, that's not enough resistance to prevent you from doing that. It just means that you are now looking in a different direction, your stability computer is still more or less keeping you pointed there fairly easily, and then you can adjust exactly how quickly you want to change your momentum to actually be in that direction. Because your helicopter's still moving laterally to the side, it's up to you to adjust how much of the side of your helicopter you're showing to the air and how much you're actually allowing to push in and drag against that air to try to get you moving forward. And you can even roll in the opposite direction to add your rotor in there to correct for your direction even quicker. This is something I wanted to bring up because in squad you're really lacking this, and in addition, the lack of yaw control you have at high speeds mean that you really need to cut into roll and pitch in order to actually cut against the airflow, which in turn means you're dropping altitude and pulling extremely aggressive maneuvers, which means essentially it's very useful for a J turn, but if you're just trying to navigate a river valley at even medium to high speeds, you're dropping a lot of altitude to do so and requiring to learn kind of a new technique. Whereas in War Thunder, if you were coming up on a turn in, say, a canyon, you could adjust for it in advance and immediately start preparing yourself by not just moving your helicopter to have its nose in the correct direction, but then applying just the right amount of roll that you need to cut your momentum in the other direction. It's a lot more of a smooth process. And also because ultimately, this is something that would require a more physics-based flight model to do perfectly, and I kind of wanted to show how, even though we now have a decent flight model in this system that's not entirely physics-based, we still are struggling to get to points like this where we can actually have air and the helicopter interacting with each other in a meaningful way, and I'm going to get more into that at the very end of the video. Now, we've talked about the good, we've talked about the bad, but we kind of have to talk about the ugly, which is the fact that under the hood, this is the same non-physics-based flight model. I landed this helicopter on this helipad, and you can tell because I'm not in line with the horizon, because there still is the arbitrary computer deciding what is and isn't landed. And the fact that I've touched down, even though my front wheel is probably off the ground right now, the physics have gone out the window, the helicopter has decided it is landed, and pretty much regardless of what I do at this point in relation to how my nose is relative to the ground, it's not going to affect me, it's not going to make me slide. I'm basically locked into this until some collective is added and my wheels are no longer touching the ground. This kind of made sense with the old flight model because obviously if you were pointed 5 degrees down, it might decide you need to be going 5,000 miles an hour into that tree, and so this makes sense. But now it kind of sticks out like a sore thumb. I really wish they would tone down some of the effects at 0% collective or add brakes that are activated at 0% collective and go back to standard wheels physics, because this really looks bad now. Before it was just one part of a very shitty overall flight model that didn't feel good in any way, and now it is kind of the sole remainder of a very, very bad system for doing things. But it also is still kind of necessary probably, because there are still a lot of things that aren't physics-based. This isn't physics-based, it's just a decent fake now. For example, if I were to yaw in place, and we ignore the fact that we're in this weird landed mode and I can even do this without screeching my tires across the ground, if we ignore the lack of realism that comes from doing this in the first place, we can start to see a problem, because this is just yaw. If we assume I was hovering in place, it would make sense. This is roll. It's a bit slower, but you can see that because I'm on the ground, it's not going to let me actually roll to the side. It's not going to let me pitch down or pitch up, but it is going to add an invisible multiplier that it has anytime you go into roll for yaw. You can tell that now when you're in the air and when you're actually rolling, and then you start to yaw as a result, it's not because of the physics of the airflow over the helicopter, it's because these two controls are actually bound together in the flight model. You can start to see how things that are done well are still entirely fake and are done wrong and start to fall apart once you're actually in a situation like this where you're on the ground and you can analyze every single thing independently without being in your traditional flight where it's harder to notice. And ultimately, this kind of goes back to what I was saying when you can never polish a turd enough that you won't be able to determine that as a turd. I kind of have gone back on that a bit because this is a really good fake and it does work really well when you're actually in flight or doing basic landings or until you actually hit the ground. But still, there are always going to be little bits here and there that you can use to determine exactly what's going on under the hood and why this doesn't make sense. If I turn off my engine right now, I will lose the landed status and I will just turn into a physical object and I will actually fall down and you can see what it should look like. And this is one of the things that I miss the most about the old heli mod. I saw a post a while back that I commented on where somebody was applauding a pilot for landing on a steep incline on Lashkar. And it was just kind of interesting because that requires zero skill in this flight model. It looks really impressive because they're just nosing down on the tip of the ledge and they're managing to keep their helicopter perfectly still. So for your average guy, it looks like, oh, that's a god tier pilot. When in reality, they just doinked their nose on a surface and got the landed message and went to 0% collective. So in the end of the day, is it a good flight model? Yes and no. I mean, it's good enough for squad for sure. When you look at the standard that they've maintained when adding any kind of new vehicle, this basically meets that standard. I'm sad it took so long to get here, and I'm sad that they didn't just completely rework it to something physics-based that could have actually been exceptional with the right input or with the right minds behind it. And in the end of the day, the heli mod did this in V9. Not as well as this, not in V9 initially, but then worked it into something better than this over the course of V10, V11. Ultimately, I feel like there's still the potential to have a phenomenal flight model, and I feel like it could have been done a lot quicker, but at the very least, this is way better than I ever thought it would be with the current system, and this pretty much fits the game. So you can decide whether you want to be alright with that, or upset about that, or whatever. Personally, I'm going to be flying helicopters a lot more, and if they actually change a few things regarding, I think, mostly the weather vane effect and hopefully the system for actually landing, I think it could actually be very enjoyable and, if not realistic, a quite nice flight model to fly with. One last thing I'd like to mention before I go is that we are still in the situation where we have very, very limited helicopter controls. My joystick technically works when I plug it in, but I can't adjust any of the sensitivity of any of the axis. I cannot use any kind of free look, like regardless of whether I'm using track IR, which I'm not. I can't even bind my mouse to be free look or anything. And if I bind a free look key to my mouse and then try to use it, it's going to lock up all my other controls. Similarly, I can't use any of the buttons on my joystick as keybinds, so although joystick support is kind of sort of technically in, it's pretty much unusable for anyone who actually wants to customize a setup. There's really no reason for me to be using a joystick over my mouse. I love flying with joystick in left hand and using my mouse as free look, and that's not something I could do. And even if it was something I could do, unless there's duplicate controls that I can have, or controls I can have that are specific to the helicopter, where I can override some of my mouse buttons, or unless I can actually use the joystick buttons, it's going to be a little bit too difficult to set something like that up with infantry controls also in mind. So there's another note on the ugly end of the spectrum is that this really probably should have been sorted out before helicopters came out. I feel like with any game that involves flying, there are different games over the past 20 years that have done it incredibly differently, and people have very strong preferences on how they'd like to do it, and the more customization you can add to control setups, the better. Anyway, with all that said, sorry for not releasing more content. I have not been playing a lot of Squad recently. Hopefully with the release of V2 I'll actually get some videos out, but hope you enjoyed it. See you in the next one.